What do you do when the King of England signs an order before sunrise without telling his own wife? What do you do when the monarch, a man raised on ceremony, tradition, and protocol, decides to override centuries of royal procedure with a single stroke of a pen at dawn in absolute secrecy? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And more importantly, why would King Charles remove Camilla's powers so abruptly and hand them to Catherine? Not William, not the Privy Council, not senior advisors, not the people he has depended on for decades, but Catherine. Quiet, calm, careful Catherine. Ask yourself, what does a king know or fear that would make him bypass everyone else? Because that is exactly what happened. And the events that unfolded inside those palace walls during the earliest hours of the morning would set off an internal shockwave that the world still hasn't fully grasped. Picture it. London is still asleep. The sky is a dull blue-gray. The city is quiet except for the distant hum of early traffic and delivery vans starting their routes. Most people are still rolling over in their beds, completely unaware that inside one of the most heavily guarded buildings in the world, the monarchy is being rearranged like pieces on a chessboard. And at the center of it all stands a king who looks like he hasn't slept in days. Let's go back to that moment. Let's walk into Buckingham Palace with you as if you were right there behind the closed doors. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the whispering staff. It wasn't the early arrival of senior advisors. It wasn't even the unusual security adjustments that had guards checking IDs twice and sealing off entire corridors. No, the first sign was the silence. A powerful, heavy, unnatural silence. The kind of silence that means something has already happened or is about to. Even the palace staff knew something was off. Normally, the palace at dawn is a soft hum of activity. Cleaners, kitchen staff, security rotations, early office workers. But that morning, no small talk, no light chatter, just footsteps, nervous glances, doors closing quietly instead of confidently. A storm was building, but no one yet knew what kind. When King Charles entered the private conference room, the advisors waiting for him expected a briefing. Maybe a health update. Maybe a legal matter. Maybe a personal issue. None expected an emergency order. Signed, sealed, and prepared at dawn. He placed it on the table like a bomb. No explanation. No context. Just the chilling weight of authority. One advisor later described the moment with a single sentence. It felt like the ground moved. But before we dive deeper, let's pause for a second. Why would a monarch choose dawn to make such a monumental decision? Why not mid-morning, when the palace is fully operational? Why not during a scheduled meeting, flanked by cameras and carefully curated messaging? Why not after consultation with the Queen Consort, the person expected to be his closest confidant? Unless, of course, the Queen Consort was the reason he acted so early. Unless Charles did not want Camilla anywhere near the room, or the decision, or the document. Unless something had happened behind the scenes that made waiting even 1 hour too risky. And here's where the contradictions start to stack up. Because if you ask insiders about Charles and Camilla's relationship, they'll tell you it's stable, even strong at times. They'll say she supports him, understands him, guides him. They'll say they are united. But the palace is a place where contradictions live comfortably. It is possible for two things to be true at the same time. A marriage can appear strong and be falling apart behind closed doors. A consort can look confident while losing influence rapidly. And a king can trust, yet be afraid. In this story, contradictions are everywhere. Because the truth is rarely smooth. The truth has jagged edges. Let's return to that room. Charles is standing. Advisors are seated, shoulders tense, waiting for him to speak. They expect him to explain. But he doesn't. Not at first. Instead, he looks at them one by one. Measured. Heavy. As if he is silently deciding who he can trust in that moment. Then he delivers the line that sets the tone for everything that follows. This cannot wait. And it cannot leave this room. Have you ever heard a monarch use those words? They carry weight far beyond secrecy. They imply danger, urgency, something deeply wrong. And the advisors knew instantly that what they were about to hear would not be routine. Before they could ask questions, Charles slid the document toward the table's center. An emergency royal order. And not just any order. A transfer of authority. From Camilla to Catherine. Do you feel how dramatic that shift is? Camilla has spent decades climbing through public hostility, media pressure, internal palace resistance, and royal hierarchy to reach her current position. Her power network is interwoven through charity boards, senior advisors, family allies, and longtime loyalists. Yet with one order, one signature, Charles rerouted the monarchy's chain of command. And the timing is the key. Because decisions like this are never spontaneous. Not at this level. Not with this magnitude. Not involving the queen consort. Something triggered it. Something real. Something urgent. But before we explore that trigger, and trust me, it is far more explosive than you think, we need to understand the emotional landscape. Imagine being Camilla, waking up expecting a normal day, only to discover that during the early hours, without warning, your role was quietly diminished. Imagine Catherine, a woman who prefers avoiding controversy, suddenly thrust into a position she didn't ask for, with responsibilities she didn't seek, with a level of authority that places her above the queen consort herself. And imagine William, watching as his father gives his wife unprecedented power, bypassing him. There's a reason this moment matters. It didn't just change palace roles. It exposed hidden fractures. Behind the polished photos, the royal events, the carefully choreographed symbolism, there are tensions, disagreements, rivalries, and shifting alliances. This Dawn decision pulled back the curtain, and what it revealed is something the public has never been allowed to see so clearly. Let's return to the introduction scene. After Charles delivered his ominous warning, the advisors scanned the emergency order, lines and clauses they had never seen before. Power shifts that should have required lengthy consultation. But this time, the king had bypassed all the usual steps. One advisor, trying to sound composed, finally asked, "Your Majesty, why Catherine?" And Charles's answer, or rather, his refusal to answer, was even more alarming. He simply said, "You'll understand soon." Now pause. Let that sink in. When a monarch refuses to justify a move of this scale, it means the justification is sensitive. Too sensitive for the room. Too explosive to share freely. Too dangerous to risk even among trusted advisors. Which brings us to the bigger question. What did Charles already know? Here's where we begin teasing the deeper layers of the story, without giving everything away yet. Because what you're about to discover across the next chapters is not just a political shakeup, not just a family disagreement, not just a strategic move. It's a crisis that began long before dawn, a crisis tied to private information, a crisis involving someone close to the throne, someone whose actions forced Charles into this sudden, unprecedented maneuver. But before we get there, we need to finish building the foundation of this introduction. After the emergency order was placed on the table, Charles gave one more instruction. Catherine must be summoned immediately. No explanation, no detail, just a name. Her name. And that's when advisors realized this wasn't just about removing Camilla. It was about replacing her immediately. And Catherine wasn't even awake yet. Picture the moment Catherine was notified. Early morning. Still quiet. Her phone lighting up with a secure call. A call she would never normally receive at that hour unless something was terribly wrong. She arrives at the palace. No makeup. No cameras. Just a heavy coat, rushed hair, and concern written all over her face. Because she could sense it. Everyone could. The atmosphere was too tense. The palace felt like it had stopped breathing. When she entered the private room, Charles dismissed the advisors. He wanted to speak to Catherine alone. And here's where the introduction ends. Because what he tells her in that room becomes the engine that drives the entire story forward. Catherine sits down. Charles looks at her with the exhaustion of a man carrying a secret too heavy for one person. He leans forward, and in a quiet but urgent voice, he says, "There's something I need to tell you before Camilla finds out." And that's where everything changes. What would you do if the King of England looked you dead in the eye and told you there was something you needed to know before his own wife learned it? Would your heart drop? Would your breath catch? Would you feel the weight of history pressing down on your shoulders? Because that is exactly what Catherine felt in that moment. Sitting across from a man who looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Let's start with the question that everyone watching this needs to ask themselves. Why would King Charles confide in Catherine before Camilla? Why her? Why now? Why in private? Why with urgency in his voice and fear in his eyes? This wasn't a casual conversation. This wasn't a briefing. This wasn't a polite royal update. This was a warning. And the moment those words left Charles's mouth, the entire atmosphere in that room shifted. It thickened. It tightened. It felt like a storm cloud settling directly over the two of them. Catherine didn't interrupt him. She didn't speak. She didn't even adjust in her seat. She just stared, waiting, because she could tell that whatever Charles was about to say wasn't just sensitive. It was dangerous. Charles's fingers trembled slightly as he removed his glasses. He rested them on the table. He pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to steady himself, trying to gather the courage to say something he had been holding back for far too long. And Catherine waited. But before Charles spoke another word, something strange happened. He stood up, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the heavy slowness of someone carrying a burden he could no longer conceal. He walked to the window overlooking the palace courtyard. He stared outside, hands clasped behind his back. And the silence grew louder. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where someone is about to break news that will change everything, but they need a moment to prepare themselves to say it? That's how this moment felt. Except this wasn't a parent telling their child something painful. This wasn't a friend revealing a confession. This was a king preparing to disclose a secret that would alter the direction of the monarchy. Catherine finally broke the silence with a simple question. Is someone in danger? Charles didn't turn around. He didn't move. But his answer sliced through the room like a knife. Yes. One word. Cold. Sharp. Unavoidable. And if that wasn't shocking enough, what he said next was even more chilling. But it isn't who you think. Catherine felt her stomach twist. Danger. Secrecy. Urgency. But who? Who did Charles believe was at risk? A threat against the monarchy? A threat against a family member? A political pressure? A private scandal? The palace has survived countless crises. For Charles to use the word danger meant something unprecedented. Catherine leaned forward slightly. Is it the children? No, Charles said. Is it William? He hesitated. Then, no. Is it you, she asked. Another pause. Longer this time. And then, it could be. The message hung in the air like smoke. Could be. Not maybe. Not unlikely. Not theoretical. Could be. Meaning the threat was not hypothetical. It was active. Catherine swallowed hard. Something inside her shifted, a mixture of fear, clarity, and rising resolve. Then tell me what's going on, she said. You brought me here for a reason. Charles nodded slowly. I did. He walked back to the table, his steps heavy with meaning. He sat down, looked Catherine directly in the eyes, and finally began to explain the truth behind the dawn emergency meeting. Except, not all of it. Not yet. He started carefully, as though choosing which pieces of the truth she was ready to hear. Last night, he began, something happened. Something that crossed a line. Something that forced me to act immediately. Catherine stayed silent. Still, focused. Charles continued. I received a message shortly after midnight. It wasn't delivered through official channels. It wasn't filtered by advisors. It came directly to me. What kind of message? Catherine asked. A warning, Charles said. About Camilla. Now pause. Think about the weight of that statement. A warning. About the Queen Consort. Delivered privately. Directly to the king. Without advisors. Without protocol. That alone is enough to destabilize a monarchy. But the tone in Charles's voice suggested this wasn't a simple complaint. Not gossip. Not politics. Not internal dissent. This was something heavier. Something darker. Catherine's eyebrows tightened. What kind of warning? Charles looked down at the table. She overstepped. The words dropped like stones. But Catherine knew that was too vague. Too broad. So she pressed him. In what way? And this is where Charles's expression changed. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if replaying something horrifying. It isn't just one action, he said. It's a pattern. A pattern I can no longer ignore. A pattern that puts the stability of the monarchy at risk. You could feel the temperature in the room drop. Because when a king says someone is threatening the stability of the monarchy, especially someone as central as the Queen Consort, it signals a crisis of the highest magnitude. But Catherine wasn't satisfied with generalities. What did she do specifically? She asked quietly. And Charles answered with a brutal honesty that surprised even himself. She tried to assume authority that isn't hers. She acted behind my back. And last night, she crossed a boundary that endangers us all. He paused. Swallowed. Looked away again. And that's why I signed the emergency order. Now let's stop here for a moment. Imagine the emotional contradiction Charles was dealing with. Camilla is his wife, his companion, his partner for decades. Yet here he was, telling Catherine, not Camilla, not advisors, not family, that Camilla had crossed a line so severe that he had to strip her powers before dawn. That is not an ordinary marital conflict. That is royal emergency territory. Catherine steadied herself. What boundary? She asked. Charles didn't answer immediately. He exhaled slowly, like a man reluctantly preparing to cross his own point of no return. It involves someone within the institution, he said, and it's connected to information she was never meant to access. Catherine's eyes widened slightly. Accessing restricted information? Acting behind the king's back? Interfering with the institution's internal processes? This was more than influence. This was intrusion. Who was she trying to undermine? Catherine asked. Charles looked at her directly. You. The word hit Catherine so hard that for a moment, she couldn't react. You. Not William. Not the king himself. Not advisors. You. Camilla had been moving against Catherine. Now here's where things become even more fascinating. Catherine is not confrontational by nature. She is diplomatic, measured, strategic, but she is not naive. She knows palace rivalry exists. She knows alliances shift. She knows every royal woman faces pressure from every angle. But being targeted directly by Camilla was something entirely different. Why would she move against me? Catherine asked, her voice low. Charles hesitated. Because she believes your influence is growing too strong. Because she sees how the public responds to you. Because she feels threatened. Threatened. One word. One emotional landmine. Camilla, threatened by Catherine. This wasn't just jealousy. This was political. And Charles confirmed it. She sees you as a challenge to her position, he said. And in her attempt to protect her status, she made a very dangerous mistake. Catherine felt her pulse quicken. What mistake? Charles leaned forward. She tried to access a file that is classified even to most senior members of the royal household. Catherine blinked. A classified file? What kind of file? Charles continued. And she wasn't supposed to know that file existed, let alone try to obtain it. Catherine's voice softened, but sharpened at the same time. What was in the file? Charles looked down. That's what I brought you here to tell you. Another pause. But not yet, he added. There's something else you need to understand first. And this right here, is the moment everything pivots. Because before Charles reveals what was inside that file, he has to reveal something even more shocking. He clears his throat. Last night, he said, Camilla confronted 2 of my advisors. She demanded access to the briefing materials for next month's strategic planning session. Catherine frowned. So? That's not unusual. It is, Charles said, when the meeting wasn't supposed to be announced yet. Catherine's breath caught. She learned about a meeting that hadn't been made public? Yes. How? Charles's voice dropped. Because someone inside leaked it to her. And suddenly the room felt different. Warmer. Tighter. More dangerous. A leak inside the palace. A secret meeting exposed. A queen consort demanding access to restricted information. And a king forced to strip her powers before dawn. And yet, this is only the surface. Because the real reason Charles acted so quickly, the real reason he transferred power to Catherine, the real reason he kept Camilla out of the room, it's connected to something even deeper. And he was just about to say it when the door suddenly opened. A royal aide stepped inside, face pale. Your Majesty, she's awake. Charles's eyes closed for a moment. Camilla, Catherine whispered. The aide nodded nervously. And she knows something has happened. What happens when the most powerful woman in the monarchy wakes up to discover that her influence, her entire kingdom of relationships, alliances, and carefully constructed authority, is slipping through her fingers? What happens when she realizes the king has acted without her? What happens when a woman who has fought for decades to secure her place beside the throne senses a shift so sudden, so quiet, so catastrophic, that it threatens everything she has built? That was the moment Camilla opened her eyes, and something in the air told her the world was different. Let's pause and ask the question no one in the palace dared to say aloud. How does a queen consort, someone who has weathered public hatred, royal scandals, media storms, and political fractures, not sense an emergency order being signed at dawn? Because Camilla has instincts. Sharp instincts. Dangerously sharp. the kind that kept her standing through some of the worst public scrutiny in modern royal history. But that morning, her instincts told her she was late. Not late for the day, late for the crisis, late to stop something, late to confront someone, late to protect herself. And the moment she walked into her private sitting room and noticed the silence, the same silence Catherine experienced, she knew immediately that something had gone terribly wrong. Camilla is not a woman who panics easily. Her power came from endurance, consistency, and the ability to maintain control even when the world was burning around her. But this was different, because for the first time in years, she sensed she had been excluded. And nothing terrifies a power player more than exclusion. She pressed the intercom button. "Where is His Majesty?" she asked sharply. The aide hesitated, which was already a mistake. "That, Your Majesty, I'm not entirely sure." "Not entirely sure?" That phrase alone ignited Camilla's anger. There are two unwritten palace rules Camilla has always insisted upon. 1. She must always know Charles's location. 2. She must always be informed before decisions begin circulating. But today, both rules had been broken, and she felt it like a crack in the foundation beneath her feet. She stood abruptly, wrapping her robe tightly around herself, anger fueling her movements. "Get me the Lord Chamberlain," she snapped. The aide swallowed. "He's unavailable." Camilla's eyes narrowed. "Unavailable? At this hour? What?" The aide hesitated again, another mistake. "He was called to a private meeting before dawn." Camilla froze. Private meeting? Before dawn? Without her? Just like that, the trapdoor opened beneath her. Because she knew what that meant. She wasn't stupid. She wasn't oblivious. She wasn't naive. A private meeting at dawn meant one thing. A crisis. A crisis she wasn't invited to. And if she wasn't invited, she might be the crisis. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt the moment your influence slips? The exact moment you realize the people you trusted are suddenly avoiding eye contact? When your name is being whispered behind closed doors? Camilla felt that in her bones as she strode through the hallway, her slippers slapping against the polished floors, her anger building with every step. Because for the first time since becoming queen consort, the palace didn't bend around her presence. Normally, when Camilla entered a corridor, staff straightened. People moved aside. Doors opened. Assistants rushed. But this morning, nothing. A staff member passing her gave a stiff nod, but didn't bow deeply. Another pretended to be focused on a clipboard. The guards looked ahead instead of acknowledging her arrival. A subtle shift, barely noticeable to an outsider. But to Camilla, it was a warning. Her power network, the web she had spent years weaving, was unraveling at its edges. And she recognized the signs instantly. When influence fades, it doesn't vanish all at once. It crumbles slowly, in tiny pieces. A shorter greeting here. An unanswered phone call there. A missing briefing folder. A postponed meeting. A closed door. This morning was all of those small warnings happening at once. She grabbed the arm of a passing staffer. "You," she commanded. "Where is His Majesty?" The staffer stiffened. "In a private conference room, ma'am." "Who is with him?" Another hesitation. Camilla's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Tell me," she demanded. The staffer swallowed. "Advisors, ma'am. And the Princess of Wales." For a moment, a split second, Camilla's expression didn't move. Then it changed. Just slightly. Barely noticeable. But unmistakable. A flicker of panic. Because if Charles had summoned Catherine, and not her, then everything Camilla feared was already happening. She released the staffer's arm. "And now we need to step back, because to understand the intensity of her reaction, you have to understand Camilla's power network." Camilla's influence didn't appear overnight. She earned it, suffered for it, fought for it. Long before she ever became queen consort, she had been building alliances. Not superficial ones, deep ones, quiet ones. Her strongest power came from senior courtiers, old political allies, long-trusted family friends, figures in the social elite, key charity leaders, select media contacts, and a handful of royal advisors who preferred her no-nonsense approach to palace drama. She built this network strategically, slowly, over 20 years. And in the last few years, she had strengthened it even more. People don't realize this, but Camilla's rise wasn't just a romantic story. It was a political one. She built a kingdom inside the monarchy, one that relied on relationships, loyalty, favors, and access. And overnight, literally overnight, she felt the pillars of that kingdom start to shake. The first collapse came in the form of silence. The second collapse came when she reached for her phone. She dialed one of her closest allies, a senior royal aide who always answered on the first ring. No answer. She tried again. Nothing. She tried a second ally. Straight to voicemail. A third. Delayed response. Cold tone. And each unanswered call was another thread snapping in her web. Another support beam of her influence falling away. Another reminder that Charles had acted first and cut her out completely. When she finally stormed toward the conference room, she was no longer walking. She was marching. Every step was a declaration. I am still queen. I am still powerful. And whoever did this will answer to me. But power is fragile. More fragile than people realize. And the irony of Camilla's situation is that she didn't know the worst part. She didn't know what Charles had told Catherine. She didn't know what emergency order had been signed. She didn't know her powers had already been transferred. She didn't know a classified file had exposed her actions. She didn't know her access had been restricted overnight. She didn't know her private movements were being monitored. She didn't know her closest advisor had already been quietly removed from their role at dawn. And she didn't know that Charles, her husband, had taken steps to protect the monarchy from her influence. So when she reached the door of the private conference room, she expected resistance. She expected negotiation. She expected a confrontation. But she didn't expect what actually happened. She grabbed the door handle, turned it sharply, locked. That alone enraged her. She knocked. Hard. Open this door, she demanded. Movement inside. A voice murmuring. But no one opened it. She slammed her palm against the wood. Open this door now. Inside, Charles stiffened. Catherine's eyes widened. The advisors went silent. Camilla's voice, sharp and furious, cut through the air again. You will open this door, or I will have it opened. Do you understand me? Charles looked toward the door, expression strained. But he didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't even shift his chair. Because he knew something Catherine didn't. He knew this moment, this exact confrontation, was coming. And he knew it would be the breaking point. Camilla pounded the door again. Charles, let me in. But before Charles could decide how to respond, whether to confront her, let her enter, or remain silent, a new voice appeared behind Camilla. A voice she did not expect. A voice that made her freeze where she stood. Ma'am, you need to come with us. Camilla turned slowly. 2 security officers stood behind her. Not staff. Not assistants. Not random guards. Senior security officers. The kind who only intervened during moments of internal risk. Camilla's face paled. What is the meaning of this? She demanded. One officer exchanged a glance with the other. His Majesty has requested that you be escorted to the East reception room. Camilla's chest tightened. Escorted. Requested. Words she had never heard used on her. And that's when the final thread snapped. Her power? Gone. Her network? Silent. Her influence? Cracked. Her authority? Challenged. Her status? Diminished. And the worst part? She still didn't know why. She didn't know what Charles had discovered. She didn't know what Catherine had just been told. She didn't know which advisor had betrayed her. She didn't know which classified file she had been connected to. She didn't know what message had arrived at midnight. She didn't know who had leaked information to her, or why. But she did know one thing. Something was happening that could destroy her. She squared her shoulders. I'm not going anywhere until I speak to the king. The first officer stepped forward. Ma'am, this is His Majesty's instruction. Camilla's breath caught, because suddenly she realized something she had never feared before. She was no longer in control. And if Charles had turned the palace against her, there was only one question left. Who else had he turned to? And the answer, the one she feared most, was sitting on the other side of that door. Catherine. Have you ever been chosen for a responsibility you didn't ask for? A responsibility so heavy, so unexpected, that it makes the air around you feel different? That was Catherine in that moment. Because whether she liked it or not, King Charles had chosen her. And not quietly, not symbolically, not ceremonially. He had chosen her decisively, strategically, urgently. But the question hovering over this moment, the one you are probably asking yourself right now, is simple. Why Catherine? Why not William the heir? Why not the cabinet? Why not the Privy Council? Why not senior advisors trained for crisis management? Why her? Why the woman who never sought the spotlight, never chased influence, never demanded authority. What did Charles see in her that triggered this extraordinary transfer of power? Before we answer that, you need to understand the emotional texture of the room. Because as Camilla was being escorted away from the door, as her influence crumbled, as her voice echoed, "I demand to speak to the king," down the corridor. Inside the room, something completely different was unfolding. Catherine was steady, poised, focused, but beneath her calm exterior, her mind was racing. She had questions, 1,000 of them, but she waited, because Catherine understands something most people don't. In a crisis, the person who speaks first usually knows the least. So she stayed still, silent, letting Charles gather his strength. He looked exhausted. Not physically, but emotionally. Like a man who had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Like someone who had made a decision that would change not just his life, but the entire monarchy. Finally he spoke. "You're the only one I can trust with this," he said quietly. That sentence alone reshaped the entire landscape of the crisis. The only one. Not one of the few. Not one I rely on. Not someone I need. The only one. Now let's dig deeper. Why would Charles say that? Why would a king, surrounded by advisors, protected by institutions, supported by decades of tradition, place his trust entirely in Catherine? To understand it, we have to go back years. Long before Catherine was the Princess of Wales. Long before she married William. Long before the public adored her elegance, compassion, and sense of duty. Charles had seen something in her from the beginning. A stillness, a steadiness, a strength that did not seek attention but commanded respect. A quiet discipline that made people underestimate her, until she acted. Even early palace insiders noticed it. "She doesn't talk much," one advisor once said, "but when she does, it's always the right thing." Charles valued that. Because kings are surrounded by noise, opinions, agendas, egos, chaos, pressure, Catherine was different. She listened. She absorbed. She analyzed. She waited. And when she spoke without ego. That alone made her invaluable. Now add another layer. Catherine's public approval. The public trusts her in a way they haven't trusted many royals in decades. Polls consistently show her as one of the most respected members of the monarchy, admired by all age groups, all demographics, all political groups. She doesn't polarize. She stabilizes. She doesn't escalate. She soothes. She doesn't divide. She unites. In a moment when the monarchy is fragile, the stability she brings isn't just helpful. It's essential. Now at a third layer. The private one. Over the years, Catherine had become Charles's quiet advisor. Not officially, not publicly, but privately. During family tensions, during media storms, during internal disagreements. Charles often sought her perspective. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't reactionary. She wasn't manipulative. She was calm, thoughtful, measured. She saw the human impact behind decisions. She understood the long-term consequences. She never exaggerated, never dramatized, never weaponized personal relationships. In her, Charles found something rare. A royal who understood the weight of the institution, and the human lives inside it. This is why, when confronted with a crisis triggered by betrayal, secrecy, and destabilization, Charles didn't turn to seasoned advisors. He turned to the one person who would neither panic nor exploit the situation. But Catherine didn't know that yet. She only saw a distressed king. So she asked carefully, "Tell me what happened." Charles rubbed his temples. "Camilla," she accessed something that was never meant for her eyes. Catherine's pulse quickened. "The classified file?" He nodded. "Yes." And she didn't stop there. Catherine's throat tightened. "What else did she do?" Charles hesitated. And here's where the story becomes even more dramatic. "She made contact with someone outside the palace last night." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Charles looked away. "I don't know." "But she spoke to them for nearly an hour. Do you know what was discussed?" "No," he said. "But I know this. Immediately afterward, a second message arrived for me. One that could only have come from someone who knew she'd made that call." Catherine leaned back slightly, alarmed. "A second message?" Charles nodded. "A warning. About her intentions." Catherine took a slow breath. "So someone out there is watching her, tracking her, maybe even influencing her." Charles looked at her sharply. "That's what I need you to figure out." Catherine froze. "You want me to investigate her?" "Yes," he said softly. "I need someone I can trust to find out who she contacted what she learned, and what she plans to do next. Now pause. This is the moment the responsibility shifted. Fully, irrevocably. Because Charles wasn't asking Catherine for advice anymore. He was asking her to act, to intervene, to step into a role she never asked for. The monarch's internal protector, the stabilizer, the investigator, the safeguard, and she felt the weight of it immediately. "I'm not trained for this," she whispered. "You don't need training," Charles replied. "You need clarity, and you need caution. The institution is in danger, and you're the only one who can help me contain the fallout." Contain the fallout. That phrase made Catherine's skin prickle. "Why not, William?" she asked. Charles sighed deeply. This part hurt him. Because William would confront her, and that would escalate everything. Catherine's heart sank. "And you think I won't escalate it?" "You'll handle it thoughtfully," Charles said. "You'll handle it quietly. And most importantly, she won't see you coming." That last part made Catherine go still. Camilla wouldn't see her coming. Because Catherine had never played the political game. She had never jockeyed for influence, never pulled strings, never maneuvered for power. She had existed above the battlefield. And that, ironically, gave her an advantage no one else in the palace had. Charles continued. "Camilla believes her real adversaries are me, and William, and the advisors blocking her access. She doesn't see you as a threat. That makes you the only one who can get close enough to understand what she's doing." Catherine's eyes lowered. This was no longer about responsibility. It was about danger. "Charles, why now? What was in that file that triggered all of this?" Charles hesitated, the longest hesitation yet. And when he finally spoke, his voice broke slightly. "It wasn't about her." Catherine blinked. "What do you mean?" "The file she accessed, it was about the future line of succession." Catherine's blood turned cold. "What part of it?" she asked. And Charles shook his head slowly. It contained sensitive evaluations, internal reports, private concerns, things that were never meant to leave the king's eyes. Catherine swallowed hard, and she looked at it. She tried to. He paused, and she succeeded in seeing just enough to be dangerous. Catherine felt her stomach twist. What exactly did she see? Charles exhaled deeply. "She saw your name." Catherine's breath caught. "Mine? Why mine?" Charles looked at her with tired, haunted eyes. "Because part of the document outlined a contingency plan that places significant responsibility in your hands, under specific circumstances." Catherine's throat went dry. A contingency plan. Her name. Specific circumstances. She leaned forward. "What circumstances, Charles?" He clenched his jaw. "The kind that occur only if something happens to William." The room froze. Catherine stared at him. "Something happens to William?" Charles nodded silently. "And Camilla saw your name connected to that scenario." A cold wave rushed through Catherine's body. "She thinks I'm what? Preparing to replace him? Or preparing to step above her?" Charles said quietly. "And that is what made her panic." Catherine pressed her hands together tightly. "This is why she moved against me." "Yes," Charles said. "And why she cannot be allowed to continue escalating." Catherine breathed in slowly, deeply. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Charles leaned closer. "I need you to take on the authority I transferred to you. Immediately. Quietly. And I need you to understand what comes next." Catherine held his gaze. "And what comes next?" Charles's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "We prepare for the possibility that Camilla is not acting alone." Before Catherine could respond, before she could even process the implications, another knock sounded at the door. This time soft, controlled, measured. Charles froze. Catherine looked toward the door, heart pounding. The advisor outside spoke quietly. "Your Majesty, there's something you need to see. Something urgent. Concerning Camilla." A chill spread through the room. Not the kind you feel when someone opens a window. The kind you feel when danger shifts from theoretical to active. The restricted wing. If you don't know palace protocol, here's what makes that phrase so alarming. The restricted wing is not a ceremonial space. It's not a guest area. It's not even a storage wing. It is the most protected, most sensitive, most limited access area of the entire royal residence. Only 5 people have clearance on a normal day. 5. Not 6. Not 10. 5. And guess who's not on that list? Camilla. The queen consort, a woman with immense privilege, access, and influence, is explicitly barred from that wing. Why? Because the restricted wing contains 3 things. Materials related to national security, private royal archives that date back centuries, succession evaluations, updated annually, stored under intense protection. And so when the advisor said, "She's demanding access," you could practically feel the air get ripped out of the room. Charles's body tensed instantly. Catherine felt her pulse pick up, the implication hitting her like a wave. Camilla was not backing down. She was escalating. And not quietly, not subtly, not through manipulation or whispers, but openly, forcefully, directly, which meant something else. She was desperate. That was the most dangerous kind of Camilla, the one who felt cornered. Catherine's mind raced. What does she want in the restricted wing? She asked. Charles didn't hesitate. She thinks the answers are there. Answers about the file she accessed. The file. The one containing Catherine's name. The one outlining future contingencies. The one Camilla was never meant to see. Catherine swallowed hard. And what exactly is she looking for? She asked carefully. Charles exhaled. Confirmation. Confirmation of what? He hesitated. Long enough for Catherine to realize he was choosing his words with extreme care. She wants proof that she hasn't been replaced. The room went completely still. Replaced. That word is nuclear inside the palace. Because Camilla's entire life, ever since stepping fully into the royal role, has been shadowed by insecurity, public scrutiny, internal hierarchy, unpopularity, whispers, comparisons, Diana's legacy, royal tradition, role confusion, succession fears. And beneath all of that, a single silent fear, that her position was never fully secure. And now, after accessing a file with Catherine's name, she believed the monarchy had quietly chosen someone else. Someone younger, someone more stable, someone more beloved by the public, someone she had always quietly feared. Catherine. In her mind, the restricted wing didn't just hold documents. It held proof of betrayal, proof that her reign was temporary, proof that Charles never intended her power to be permanent, proof that the monarchy didn't trust her, proof that her influence was slipping, and desperate people do dangerous things. What has she said? Catherine asked. Charles looked sick. She told security that if she isn't given access, she will make her concerns public. Catherine felt her stomach drop. Public? As in, she threatened to contact the press. That alone was catastrophic. A queen consort threatening to leak internal royal conflict? It would be the biggest palace scandal since the abdication. Charles rubbed his temples, his voice cracking under the weight of it. She has never threatened anything like this before. Ever. Not once. Catherine could tell he was devastated. Not just as a monarch, but as a husband. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Catherine whispered, "What triggered this? What set her off so suddenly?" And Charles finally revealed the piece he had withheld. Something happened last night. Something outside the palace. Something I hoped would stay contained. But it didn't. Catherine straightened. What happened? Charles took a deep breath. The kind you take when you're about to reveal something you wish you could take back. At 1:12 a.m., I received an urgent encrypted message. Catherine frowned. From whom? He shook his head. It was anonymous. A secure channel. High priority. It bypassed normal filters and landed directly in my private inbox. One only 3 people in the government even know exists. Her heart rate increased. What did it say? Charles looked at her, not with fear, but with dread. It said Camilla had been compromised. Catherine blinked. Compromised? By whom? Charles closed his eyes for a moment. That's what we still don't know. Catherine pressed her hand against her chest, grounding herself. Was there more to the message? Yes. He stood, pacing slightly, the weight of memory tightening his shoulders. There was a warning. Catherine whispered. What kind of warning? He turned back to her. The message said that Camilla had been in contact with someone who intends to destabilize the royal succession. Catherine froze. Destabilize the royal succession. That can't be possible, she said carefully. Who would even have the power? But Charles interrupted her, his voice breaking. This person knew details they should not have known. Specific internal protocols, private discussions, sensitive evaluations. Someone close to the institution is feeding them classified information. Catherine's skin prickled. And they're using Camilla, she whispered. Charles nodded. A pawn, he said softly. A conduit. Or perhaps something worse. The silence was suffocating. Finally, Catherine said, You think she's being manipulated? Yes, Charles replied. But I don't know by whom. Or why. Or for whose gain? Catherine swallowed. And the emergency order was the only way to limit her access before she did something catastrophic, Charles answered. It made sense. It was brutal. It was cold. It was devastating. But it was the only thing that made sense. Still, Catherine needed clarity. What exactly do they want, she asked. And Charles gave the answer she feared most. They want to control, or disrupt, the next era of the monarchy. Catherine looked down at her hands. And slowly, the pieces began to connect. The file. Her name. The midnight call. The collapse of Camilla's power network. The anonymous message. The threat to the succession. The restricted wing confrontation. And something else, something subtle, clicked in her mind. Charles, someone leaked the existence of that file to her, didn't they? He nodded slowly. Yes. And someone told her your contingency plan mentions me. Another nod. And someone knows that your succession evaluations contain concerns. Charles closed his eyes. Someone wants to break the chain, he said quietly. And they're using Camilla to start the fracture. Catherine felt her spine straighten. Do you know who it is? Charles hesitated, then shook his head. Not yet. But I know this. There's someone inside. Someone with access. Someone who understands how to weaponize her insecurity. Catherine took a steady breath. And I assume they'll strike again? Charles stared at her, expression darkening. They already have. A long pause. What do you mean? She asked. He sat down again, this time looking directly at her with an expression that stabbed straight into her chest. There was a second message, he said. Catherine inhaled sharply. What did it say? Charles's voice lowered to a whisper. It said the danger was no longer just conceptual. It said the palace should prepare for an internal breach. A breach involving someone very close to the family. Catherine's pulse raced. How close? Charles looked at her with pained intensity. Close enough to damage everything in a single move. Before Catherine could respond, before she could even process the implications, the advisor outside knocked again. Hard this time. Your Majesty, she's not backing down. Charles stiffened. She's demanding that if she cannot access the restricted wing, then she will speak to the press in the next hour. Catherine's breath caught, and the advisor added one more line, a line that deepens the crisis. She says she already knows enough to bring the entire palace down. What do you do when your own queen consort threatens to bring down the palace you are sworn to protect? What do you do when the woman standing beside you, the woman wearing the crown, insists she will go to the press unless she's given access to the most sensitive corridors of royal power? What do you do when betrayal is no longer a rumor, but a countdown? Because that's exactly the moment King Charles found himself in. This wasn't politics. This wasn't rivalry. This wasn't palace gossip. This was a crisis. A crisis triggered not by Camilla's ambition, but by something far more dangerous. The midnight message. The message that arrived long after the palace had gone quiet. The message that came from no known source. The message that bypassed security filters. The message marked with a classification level normally reserved for foreign espionage. And the message that exposed something Charles could no longer ignore. Catherine leaned forward, her heart beating fast. What was in the message? Tell me everything. Charles exhaled, deeply, shakily, as though the memory itself weighed on him. You need to understand how it came in, he said. It wasn't through my secure line. It wasn't through encrypted channels used by the Foreign Office. It wasn't through the intelligence service. It wasn't through the Defense Secretariat. He paused, letting the impact settle. It came through the only line that bypasses all those systems, the line used for imminent threats to national stability. Catherine felt a shock ripple through her chest. You're saying it was treated like a terrorist alert? Charles nodded grimly. Yes. But it wasn't about foreign enemies, he continued. It was about someone inside these walls. Catherine's jaw tightened. What exactly did it say? Charles closed his eyes briefly, recalling the moment. It said, the Queen Consort has been compromised. She is being manipulated by a hostile actor. Immediate containment required. Catherine went cold. Hostile actor, she repeated slowly. That's intelligence language. You mean someone is using her? Yes, Charles whispered. Using her, or controlling her. Catherine shook her head, disbelief mixing with dread. But how? Camilla isn't reckless. She's not careless. She's not easily swayed. That's what frightened me most, Charles replied. She's not reckless. She's not impulsive. Yet something made her do things wildly out of character. Catherine felt a chill crawl up her spine. What exactly did she do? Charles sat down again, rubbing his forehead. She made a midnight phone call. Silence. To whom? Catherine asked. That's the problem, Charles whispered. We don't know. She used a private line, one she should not have access to. And she spoke for nearly an hour. Catherine frowned. So she contacted someone. But what about the return message? Why would they warn you? Charles looked up, eyes haunted. Because whoever sent it doesn't want Camilla punished. They want her neutralized. Quietly, Catherine inhaled sharply. You think the same person manipulating her is the one who warned you? Yes, Charles said quietly. To create panic. To force my hand. To destabilize the institution. Why warn you at all then? She asked. Because they wanted exactly this, Charles replied. A confrontation. A fracture. They want the monarchy divided internally, so they can exploit the chaos. Catherine sat back, trying to piece it together. And that midnight message. That's what triggered you to sign the emergency order. Charles nodded. It left me no choice. If her behavior escalated even once more, if she gained access to sensitive material, the damage could be irreversible. He looked away. But I didn't expect her to react like this. I thought she would deny, deflect, possibly accuse. But I never imagined she would threaten the press. Catherine's voice dropped. She must be terrified. Terrified people are unpredictable, Charles replied, his voice cracking. And unpredictable people are dangerous. Another knock. Soft. Tense. The advisor spoke again. Your Majesty, she's refusing to move to the East reception room. She says if you don't speak to her directly, she will escalate. Escalate. Charles repeated under his breath. A simple word. But in royal crisis language, it's explosive. Catherine placed a steadying hand on the table. Charles, if someone is manipulating her, if someone is feeding her just enough information to panic her, then her escalation isn't about power. Charles looked at her sharply. It's about fear, she continued. And fear makes people cling to the very thing they think they are losing. Charles closed his eyes. He knew she was right. But Catherine wasn't finished. You said she accessed something in the classified file. But you didn't tell me what she saw. Charles swallowed hard. She saw one sentence, he said. And that sentence was enough to set all of this in motion. What sentence? Catherine asked. It said, in the event of an internal breach, the Princess of Wales may be granted provisional authority. Catherine's stomach twisted. The Princess of Wales, she whispered. Not William. Not William, Charles confirmed. And not Camilla. The implication hit like a hammer. A crisis plan that made Catherine, not Camilla, the stabilizing force. A plan Camilla never knew existed. A plan she was never supposed to see. A plan that proved her deepest insecurity was real. The monarchy trusted Catherine more. Catherine pressed her lips together. That explains why she targeted me. Why she tried to undermine my position. Charles nodded. And why she's now demanding access to the restricted wing. She thinks the proof of her replacement is inside. Catherine's voice cracked slightly. But why me? Why would the file name me instead of William? Charles finally gave the answer he had been avoiding. Because the evaluation reports suggested that if a crisis came from inside the family, William couldn't act objectively. Catherine froze. Inside the family, meaning the threat was not external, not foreign, not political. It was personal. Charles, she whispered, are you saying they believe the internal threat could involve someone close to William? Someone he couldn't act against? Charles lowered his eyes. Yes. Someone like Camilla, Catherine said. Or someone connected to her, Charles replied. Catherine's pulse raced. So the Crown created a scenario where I, not William, would be responsible for stabilizing the monarchy. Charles nodded heavily. And when Camilla saw your name, everything spiraled. Catherine leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. Tell me about the second message. Charles's eyes darkened. It was worse. How? His voice lowered to a whisper. It said there was a leak inside the palace. Someone close to the royal household. Someone feeding Camilla information she shouldn't have. Close? How close? Catherine asked slowly. Charles clenched his jaw. Close enough to know things even some senior advisors don't. Catherine felt a cold pressure in her chest. Someone inside. Someone trusted. Someone with access to restricted information. Someone who understood palace operations deeply. A family member? A senior aide? A royal household insider? A private secretary? A security liaison? Catherine steadied herself. Is this why you summoned me? She asked. Charles exhaled. You were named in the file because you're the only one who could investigate without raising suspicion. And without emotional conflict, Catherine added quietly. Charles looked down. And because I needed someone who wouldn't put personal loyalty above the stability of the monarchy. Before Catherine could respond. Before she could ask more, the advisor outside knocked again, urgency rising in his voice. Your Majesty, she's refusing containment. Charles turned his head, dread washing over his expression. She's insisting that if she can't see the restricted wing, she wants answers. Now, directly from you. Catherine put her hand on the table to steady herself. She won't stop until she gets something, Catherine whispered. She's in fight mode. She's terrified. She has to be stopped, Charles said. She has to be reassured first, Catherine countered. Right now she's cornered. Cornered people lash out. Charles looked at her, anguish flickering through his eyes. What do you suggest? Catherine took a breath, slow, deliberate, purposeful. You need to tell her you will meet her. But not here. Not alone. Not without preparation. Charles frowned. Why? Because she's not the only one involved, Catherine said quietly. And the person manipulating her may be watching her every move. Another knock, this one louder, sharper. Your Majesty, she's headed toward the west corridor. Security cannot contain her without direct instruction. Catherine looked at Charles. You have to move. Now. Charles stood slowly, his face pale, his expression conflicted. Where is she going? He muttered. The advisor answered from outside the door, the words carrying enough weight to push us into the next chapter. She's headed toward the private archives. Charles froze. Catherine inhaled sharply. Because the private archives hold one thing Camilla should never see. The sealed envelope Charles wrote months ago. The envelope addressed to Catherine. For a moment, everything stopped. Not metaphorically. Literally. Charles's breath caught. Catherine's heartbeat stalled. Even the advisor outside the door went silent, as if he knew the words he had just spoken were about to detonate the morning in ways none of them were prepared for. Because the private archives are not a place you wander into. They are not a room you stumble across. They are not even marked on standard palace maps. They are the heart of royal secrecy. Inside those archives are documents not seen by the public for centuries. Personal letters from monarchs long dead. Strategic memos. Succession evaluations. Private correspondences. Sealed instructions. And one particular item that Catherine now knew was the most dangerous thing Camilla could possibly find. The sealed envelope addressed to Catherine. An envelope Camilla wasn't supposed to know existed. An envelope written by Charles months ago, long before this crisis. Long before the midnight message. Long before the dawn emergency order. An envelope that spelled out instructions for Catherine alone, should internal instability ever threaten the crown. If Camilla found that, if she opened it, if she realized what Charles had placed in Catherine's hands, even hypothetically, this wouldn't be a crisis. It would be a war. Charles, Catherine whispered urgently. You have to stop her. But Charles stood frozen, not like a king weighing strategy, but like a husband whose heart was being torn in two. This isn't her, he murmured, shaking his head as if trying to clear the fog. She doesn't behave like this. She's never barged into restricted areas. She's never threatened to involve the press. She's never raised her voice like that. Catherine understood the conflict raging inside him. This wasn't just about protecting the monarchy. This was about confronting the woman he had loved and defended for decades. But the monarchy couldn't survive his hesitation. Charles, Catherine said more firmly, someone is manipulating her. Yes, someone is feeding her fear. Yes, but her actions are her own. And right now, those actions could collapse everything. He breathed in sharply. What if she finds the envelope? He asked, his voice breaking. Catherine didn't look away. She can't. You know that. He swallowed, dread pooling in his eyes. If she sees that I prepared instructions for you. If she sees that your role was defined months before this crisis, she'll feel betrayed. Catherine exhaled slowly. She already feels betrayed. It was a truth Charles didn't want to acknowledge, but had to. He looked at her again, vulnerability etched across his face. Will you come with me? Catherine hesitated for half a second, not because she feared Camilla, but because she understood the emotional gravity of the moment. But she nodded. Yes. And just like that, the king and the future queen rose from the table together, stepping into a confrontation that would reshape the fate of the monarchy. The walk to the archives. The walk through the corridor felt longer than it really was. Security officers trailed behind them, tense and alert. Advisors whispered urgently into communication devices. Palace staff kept their heads down, pretending not to hear the brewing storm. The palace was awake now, but not in the calm, orderly way it usually woke up. This was different. Electric, tense, breathless. News travels fast inside stone walls. Staff knew something was wrong. They didn't know what, but they knew the queen consort was storming through restricted corridors, demanding access to protected documents. That alone was enough to break the palace's illusion of calm. As Charles and Catherine rounded the corner toward the archives, they heard her voice. Loud, razor-sharp, filled with fury. "Open this door. Now." Catherine and Charles stopped. There she was, Camilla. Not the polished public figure smiling for cameras. Not the composed consort navigating royal duty with a glass of gin and a dry joke. This Camilla was unrecognizable. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her robe tied hastily, her breathing rapid, her anger tearing through every word. Two senior security officers stood in front of the locked archive door, forming a physical barrier. "Your Majesty," one officer said carefully, "you do not have clearance for this section. Don't you dare lecture me about clearance." Camilla snapped. "I am the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. Open this door." Her voice echoed down the hall. And then she saw them, Charles and Catherine. Camilla's face changed instantly. The rage didn't vanish. It shifted, sharpened, focused, like a spotlight turning toward a performer who didn't know they were on stage. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with venomous disbelief. Of course she's with you." Catherine felt Charles tense beside her. Camilla took a slow, deliberate step forward, eyes locked on Catherine. "Tell me," she hissed, "was this your plan all along? Smile sweetly."